The title of the keynote is Bridging the Gap. And our keynote speaker, she is a frequent conference speaker. She's coming from the US. She's a Twitcher and she's a podcaster, so it's really publicly available and it is a lot of stuff. She's an Angular expert and she's also a very entertaining speaker. Please welcome Alyssa Nicoll.
So thank you all for being here on such short notice. We had some new news about the product come in, and I wanted to gather you all together. Layla, actually, could you turn your camera on, please? I'm going to bring you in on this.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, just one sec. Hi.
Layla, are you still in your jammies?
I'm sorry, but it's like 3:30 in the morning. So I'm really sorry. I didn't have I didn't have time to get dressed. I'm sorry.
So I brought you here because I want to talk to you all about the work that Ed did on the UI. Did you all see what he did?
Yeah. I did all the backend code for that. Like I did all the API work.
So
right.
I mean, you made an API call, right? But like, did you see what Ed did to like the forms? Amazing. So beautiful. But Layla, do you want to go ahead and pitch your idea? I know you were talking to me about it yesterday, your time. You had briefly mentioned that you had one, so I thought maybe you could present it today.
Yeah, so I thought we could change the way that we architected the
Oh my
APIs.
gosh, I just had the best idea ever. I was staring at the UI that Ed did, and I was thinking, instead of us having it flow directly from the form A to the product form, we could bring in another like splash screen type thing, and we could add super animations, maybe some like, I've seen like animated glitter. I bet he could do that. Okay, let's do it. Hello, hi. I know, a weird intro. It's fine, it's totally fine. So as you can see, there are a lot of uncomfortable situations. We're in, a hybrid world, a virtual world. There's a lot of calls. But I've honestly had some of these things happen in person meetings. But there's a lot of uncomfortable situations that Layla and myself tried to address in this skit that we did. You're welcome. It was very cringe for me to watch myself. But I wanted to demonstrate some of these gaps, right? And so I want to define this first, right? Because the word gaps is kind of strange, and we reference it a lot in this talk. So let me go back and say, what exactly are gaps? In the dictionary, a break or hole in an object or between two objects, an unfilled space or interval. And gaps in this talk specifically relevant to developers. Now, Layla and myself, I usually have her here to co-present, but she's not with us today, have these 5 gaps that we identified. But I know there are many others that we don't have time to dive into today. And if there's one that particularly, is like, oh, this gap, could you please address this gap next time? I'll be at the Progress booth all day, find me all day. So come hang out. I brought a lot of weird American candy that you can't get here, I've heard. So come get some candy, talk to me about gaps, especially if one of these really seem to speak to you personally. I'd love to hear about it. But yes, Layla, check it out. Layla codes it at Alyssa Nicoll. My DM is always open, so if you can't come by the booth or you're just too shy, maybe that's not your style, DM me, we can talk. But the first gap I want to address today is personality, from the way that people think to how they approach their problems in a technical setting or not. So has anyone heard of the Enneagram test? Anybody? Nobody? Really? That's exciting to me because I fell in love. I'm very much a big naysayer to all these online quizzes, like find your My Little Pony now. I'm like, obviously I'm Pinkie Pie, right? Like, what is this quiz now? I was amazed by the Enneagram test. As soon as I took it, I was like, okay, this is really creepy how specific it is to me personally. So I made all my friends and family take it as a good person does. And it's not a short quiz, like she's lengthy, but I pestered them until they took it. And I was like, so this says your type, does that match what you think you are? And they're like, yeah, this is me exactly. So it's actually been really enlightening and a really cool tool to use to understand how other people think. Because I like my sister, for example, I was like, this is how you see the world? And she was like, this is how I see the world. And I'm like, well, you see the world weird, right? So it's honestly helped me in personal relationships, but also with team building things. So these are the different 9 types, and I see that I have the number 9 on all of them. How did that happen? We're all number 9 today. I think peacemaker's number 9, perfectionist number 1, so I'll fix the numbering. But essentially, it puts you in one of these categories, and I'm a challenger, turns out. But I was talking to a coworker the other day who is not a challenger. And I just had this really bizarre interaction with him where we were about to go live. We do a lot of live streaming in, DevRel. You can imagine there's a lot of weird asks. And there's a lot of, yeah, I can do that, or I can come up with that. So we were about to go live on a live stream, but we were also at a conference in person. And we were organizing a charity drive for a local school. And so I was telling the volunteers, can you stand here and hand out pencils? Can you stand here and hand out markers, right? And I turned to one of my coworkers and I said, hey, Bob, we'll call this person Bob. Hey, Bob, can you count these pencils for me? I need to know how many we have so we can divide it up and every bag gets the even number of pencils, right? And Bob stares at me and he's like, I go live in 2 minutes. And I go, yeah, Bob, I go live with you in 2 minutes. I understand that's, a pressing time constraint, but just count the pencils and then go live, right? Bob was so overwhelmed that he just kind of goes and walked away from me. Didn't say, I cannot count the pencils, Alyssa. I need to focus on going live, right? It was just a very bizarre interaction. And after studying different Enneagrams, I realized that it wasn't that Bob just hated me, right? Because oftentimes I'm like, oh, well, it's me, right? This person hates me. It's that what I was asking them to do in that moment was unfair for them. It's not where their strengths lie. They cannot multitask, or they cannot impromptu do that thing. So there's another story I have about a coworker who was sitting down and very genuinely over drinks was like, can you please explain to me how you multitask? And I was like, do 2 things at one time? And he, like, yeah, how do you do that? And I was like, oh, this is not, right? So I feel like we oftentimes, whether it's in development, in design, in our everyday lives, we take for granted things that sometimes are super, super easy for us and might be difficult for other people. So when Layla and I were going through the personality gap, particularly with developers, we identified some things, and you might have noticed quite a few of them in the Zoom call that we did, or didn't do, that you can do to help your team out. So smaller breakaways, because not everyone is comfortable, believe it or not, speaking up in front of people. So if you have smaller groups for your team for specific meetings that you actually genuinely want your teammates' feedback, smaller breakaways and a defined agenda. This one threw me because I'm very much in the moment, right? If you ask me my opinion on something, you want to brainstorm something, you want me to go live in 2 minutes, right? I can do that. That's really easy for me. It's not a challenge. But I found out that I work with quite a few teammates that they want to be really well prepared. They want to know what we're going to talk about in the meeting. They want to know what the asks are going to be, even if it is, we're going to brainstorm topic X, right? So it sounds super simple, but smaller breakaways, defined agendas, awareness that not everyone has the same strengths as you on your team, and then time to be able to record meetings because not everyone can make it. Schedules with international and otherwise are, it's easier to do follow-ups too, if you can look back on a recording. We're going to hit up number 2. We're chugging right along. I will spend a little bit more time in the middle of these, but it does not mean that one gap is particularly better than other gaps. It's just how the lay of the land is. But knowledge gap, we identified different types of knowledge gaps. As in the introduction, I am originally an Angular developer in GDE, but I've been learning a ton of .NET lately. And Layla she's an MVP, and she lies on the .NET side of life. So very obviously, we were like, oh, stacks, a knowledge gap, right? Web, mobile, .NET, cross-platform, where you work, where you're comfortable. Polarity, so this one was from like front-end versus back-end, so you can, believe it or not, did you know? You can be a .NET developer that does front-end work and never touches JavaScript, right? When I found that out, I was like, what? What are they doing over there? This is crazy. So polarity, front-end versus back-end, levels of knowledge, senior versus junior, personal, new skills to you. So it's been really interesting entering the .NET scene because I've been doing Angular since Angular 1 came out. And I've been running in those circles. I'm very comfortable with JavaScript, CSS, UI, all that. And so as I learned .NET, I'm like, wow, I'm back at square one. So just because someone might be a senior developer, they might be working with a stack that's totally new to them, right? So a personal knowledge gap. So yes, recognizing the gap is obviously really important in yourself, in others, in your team members. I have something, so I've got 2 blips of code. We've got blip A of code and blip B of code, right, revised. And Layla and I have this back and forth, and I'm going to share a clip of it with you real quick of what...
Okay, Layla, so I did some code, right? And I'm really, really proud and excited. Can you check it out? Like, I'm super excited. My var name here, and then I'm like formatting the string over there, and then look, it writes it.
Really?
It's actually really cool.
If you're into C#, this is a really old, crappy way of doing it. Alyssa, come on. Don't you know there's this really cool new way? Why don't you know this? This is how you should do it, string interpolation. So much better. Do it this way. Look, I'm on 2 lines, you are on 3.
So it's very funny. With my boss 2 years ago was like, we should start a Twitch stream. And I was like, you should do that, right? And tell me how that goes for you. And she was like, no, we should do it. And I was absolutely terrified of just live coding in the moment, being scrutinized by random viewers online. But doing it over and over again, it's kind of like made me numb to that, and it's a new skill set that I have, and I'm really grateful for it. But doing this exercise with Layla, this back and forth of her showing me how to do a better way, it reminded me of different guests that I've had, whether on podcasts or on Twitch, throughout the years, and different responses that I can get to refactoring code. So a word of caution with this gap, it's always useful to gauge someone's interest in your feedback. Because believe it or not everyone wants to know how the CSS grid works, right? Like, what? Say what? Not everybody wants to know that. So make sure that, before you give a teammate some feedback, make sure that they have a listening ear, that that's a skill they actually need to have. But then also, how you go about teaching, how you say things, right? So let's watch Layla try again.
So Layla, I have this really cool code, and I'm like, look at my name, and then I'm like formatting the string, and then it actually prints it out. Isn't that cool? Right?
Well, you know that you're quite into JavaScript. Shall I show you something that's kind of familiar to you?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Look, does that not look a little bit similar to what you do in JavaScript?
Yeah.
Yeah, if we moved that $sign and stuck it here, would that not
even
be quite familiar?
it combines 2 of our, I like it.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? So
nice.
You can do it that way, perfectly fine what you did with your way, but you could do it this way as well.
So I actually noticed that people I gravitate towards, they have this type B, the second video, way of correcting or teaching or helping, and it's not even about aggression level, really. It's all about tone and intent as you help someone. And I find that this is actually a really huge thing that can set the dynamic of your team, just the way you correct someone, right? The tone in which you teach someone a new thing. But bridging a gap if it needs to be, because as I mentioned before, it's really good to know where your team is coming from and if this is actually a skill set they need to have. So yes, individually, how we can bridge the knowledge gap, some things. Pair programming is always awesome. Self-study, a little bit of humility goes a long way. If you're like, my team doesn't support pair programming, would super challenge you to stream or to go online and like get an audience that way. It's been really eye-opening, and I think it's made me a better developer and teacher as well. But team mindfulness and respect, as I mentioned, of like, where's my team at? What levels are they at? Because we mentioned those different levels. And offer different ways to learn, right? Not everyone, I'm very much an audiobook person, and my team does like personal building and reading books that are outside of code, outside of development. And my lead, she actually was like, hey, I just finished this one on the plane, do you want it? And I was like, no, I'll download the audio version, because I am very much an audio listener. Like, that's how I learn, that's how I listen to things. So knowing where your team's at, different ways to learn, and creating a safe place to fail. And the safe place to fail leads nicely into this next segment. As I've been streaming, I have extreme ADHD, and I kind of just go with it. Some people that stream with me can either handle that or not handle that, but there's a lot of rabbit holes, right? They'll be showing me this latest thing, like, oh, here's minimal APIs in C#, and I'm like, yes! And somehow we end up with like, who created C# and what year was that exactly, right? Like, I can really rabbit hole down into places that people don't expect me to go. And I found it fascinating that a lot of different people who I'd have on stream with me, when I got to a certain point, would say, we don't have time for that, or Alyssa, that is way off topic. And it was only through streaming with people who did the opposite, who would just straight up look at me in the camera and be like, I don't know. And I'd be like, oh, cool, let's move on, right? And then we'd move on. That I realized a lot of people don't feel comfortable saying, I don't know. Like, it's just something they will actually do anything but say those words. So this is my little guy, call him Mr. Milks. And he is 3 now. And I was like, oh my, is this something we're born with? Because there'd be things, I'd be like, what is that, Daniel? And he'd be like, and he would just make it up, like just completely make it up. And I was like, it's okay to say I don't know, right? Like, teaching him at this young age, because apparently even 3-year-olds struggle with this. But I was talking with Layla, and I was like, I don't get it. Why is this such a big deal on my team? Whether I'm live streaming, whether I'm in person with someone, it seems to be a really hard thing for a lot of people to do. And she did mention a good point about being vulnerable in certain situations can be dangerous, right? Like, if you don't know the answer to a certain question, and then people on your team are like, why are you in this role? Why are you a lead? Why are you A, B, C? And so I think that's where the other side of this equation comes in, of creating a safer place to fail, to be able to have those real conversations with teammates or with friends or with family, wherever you're at with these gaps, about where you are so that you can better yourself, right? And so number 3 out of 5, look at this, chugging right along. The parent gap, I apologize if you are not a parent. Perhaps one day you'll look back and find this really useful, but this one was super relevant to me as a new mom of a 3-year-old. So juggling life, work, and children can be really, really challenging. I especially thought so with work from home. I was like, how do people do this, right? How is this a thing? There's so many reasons, and I just kind of want to preface, even if you don't have children, maybe you're wondering, like, why is there a child in the background, of that person's Zoom call, right? Why is there a kiddo running past? There's so many reasons that you might even not, like, okay, yes, they have daycare, but guess what? It's a holiday today for daycare, but it's not a holiday for my work, right? There's things like that. Babysitter fell through. Kid is sick and they're not allowed into the school or the daycare, or maybe you only have part-time care. So there's a ton of different reasons why work from home and children happen together. And so this is the parenting gap, as I like to call it, for tech. And so there's oftentimes, this woman was doing math and I loved it. I'm gonna bring up this one, where I will like map out my life, right? And I'm like, okay, from 8 to 9, I'm doing this. From 9 to 10, I'm doing that, right? And I've got 92% going to family, 55 going to work, 30% to my community, and I got 10% extra for my video games, which should be way, way higher. But you know, you look at this math, and I don't know if any of you noticed, but it's like, it's like a lot more than 100% of our time. And I feel, I was listening, and my husband works from home too. We're both developers. He's actually the person who got me into development all those years back. And he was on a call with his boss, Chris, and Chris has 3 children. And so Zach was like, my husband was like, how do you do it, Chris? Like, how do you manage it, especially when your children are at home? And he said this, and I love this, and I really try to take it personally, like accepting that today isn't going to be a normal work day, and that's okay, right? Like, obviously, you're not going to be as productive as you normally are. And I feel like this, with or without kids in the equation, is something we should be giving ourselves, and it's called grace, right? I feel like there's so many situations, whether it's, okay, so my team now wants us to migrate away from Visual Basics. Not sure why, because it's really cool, but let's learn a new thing. There's so many times where we just have this laundry list of expectations for ourselves, and we're so critical and we're so harsh. And there's a lot of days that just aren't going to be a normal work day. You're not going to get as much done as you usually do because of X, Y, or Z. So I think giving ourselves grace in these situations. The leadership gap. So some gaps might need to be larger. Not all gaps need to be bridged. And I've actually had, I'm going to go on to this one. We all want good relationships with our boss or our leadership team, and keeping it professional is super beneficial. I actually didn't know I've been a DevRel now for 5 years. And the first year of being a DevRel, I just left my full-time dev gig, and I was like, maybe DevRel isn't for me. And the leadership team at the time, it was very, very hard to have feedback from. And it was honestly like kind of like floating adrift. And I got a new manager about like a year and a half into it, and it was like night and day different, because I was thinking, I just need to go back to full-time development. This isn't for me. So I share this story because sometimes it's honestly more about the people you're working with than the actual job that you're doing, right? Sometimes it's not about you and your skill set, but it's you not meshing well with your lead or meshing well with your team. But I think there's oftentimes that setting stronger boundaries, keeping work and personal life separate, because if you don't set these boundaries, you start to feel like you don't work from home, but that you live at work, right? So there are actually quite a few ways, let me go ahead, that you can navigate work culture and set those boundaries to have a healthy relationship. I don't struggle. This is definitely the part of the story. There's gaps that Layla struggles with, and there's gaps that Alyssa struggles with. And this is the part of the story where Layla would stand up and tell you her personal stories and tell you ways of setting boundaries. Alyssa forgets that her phone exists, and I'm not kidding. I've gone like 24 hours, and my family was like, where were you? And they know now to contact my spouse instead of me, because if it's not in front of me, it just doesn't exist. But I know there's quite a few people that really, really struggle to unplug, to have that boundary. So Layla's actually removed Slack, Teams, email from her personal phone, and it's not on that device. So it's not physically possible for her to work when she's, in the car on the way to the beach, because she doesn't have her work device with her. She's made that boundary intentionally. The physical boundary, put the laptop away if you don't have a dedicated office space. This one brings into mind, have any of you ever heard of a shutdown routine? No? It's like a turn-off routine. So whenever work from home started rising up and being more common, people really struggled with mentally putting work away, because you're at home and it's right there, right? It's just right there. And so while you're doing the dishes, maybe you're still working on that code problem in your head, or after you tuck in the kid, maybe you pop into the office to do a few emails. And so I think the shutdown routine oftentimes involves things like, okay, at 6:10 p.m., or whatever time you shut down for the day, or plan on shutting down for the day. I close my laptop, I get a cup of tea, I walk the dog, and then I close the office doors, right? Whatever, or maybe I bullet point out where I was at in my code, what I'm going to complete tomorrow morning, and then I shut down everything, right? So a shutdown routine can be really valuable if you are work from home, or maybe even if you just struggle setting those boundaries. Mentally can be another one. So yes, your shutdown routine or switch off routine, going for a walk, mentally disconnecting. And that leads us into our next and final gap, the geo gap. I'm from the States, I'm from Oklahoma. I'm very, very landlocked. I'm jealous of all of you because if you're over here in Europe, you're most likely much closer to a body of water than I am. There's just cows for hours and hours, cows and fields and grass. So very jealous of you. You seem to have a lot going for you. Layla's from London, and so it was very obvious at first, this geo gap. And in the skit that we did at first, awareness of time zones for team meetings or for impromptu discussions is super, super, super important. I'm going to go into defining the geo gap. Yes, so it's not limited to time zones and distance, but culturally. I remember the first time I got on my first international flight, and I was so excited. I was going overseas. I was going to be a big kid, and the stewardess comes down, and it was early in the morning, and she goes, "Would you like some tea?" And I was like, "Tea?" I was like, "It's 6 a.m." And she's like, "Yeah?" And I'm like, "Who drinks tea?" It's like, for my family, if you get tea out, you're either sick or it's 10 p.m. and you just can't have caffeine, so you go for tea. I'm like, what is wrong with you? What is happening? So this was a really funny one. I was so embarrassed. I love this photo because it shows off my nails. You can't see it because of the contrast, but it shows off my nails. They were sparkly. Shows off my wedding ring. And it's just me being silly, and it was a profile pic. And Layla was like way before we decided to do this talk together, she was like, "Hey, Alyssa, you know your GitHub profile picture?" I'm like, "Yeah, the cute one with my nails." And she was like, "Yeah. So for some cultures, you are actually flipping them off." And I was like, "What?" And she goes, "Yeah, you gotta do it the other way." Like, did anybody know this? Is this just me? I was utterly clueless. I was like, what? So this is the thing, right? This is part of that geo gap where you might be insulting someone with your GitHub profile and you had no intention of doing that, right? Like, that was nobody's goal here today. Another part of this, and a very obvious one for the geo gap, is time, different time zones. I really, this is like Layla's brain. She's very, very organized, my goodness. And this is like my brain, and it's not just with any time zones, it's just with any time in general. I'm just like, what day is it? What time are we? So I was really, really humbled, actually, by Layla started this organization called the Women of .NET. And she was like, "I know you're learning .NET. Come and be a part of this. You'll meet some cool women. You'll learn some cool stuff." And I said, "Cool, let's do it." And I was always impressed because we would be on a call with maybe like 10 different women, and they're all in different time zones around the world. And when she would go to be like, "Let's do this stream," or "Let's do this initiative," she would be like, "Hey, person X, does 11:45 p.m. your time work for you? I know that's late." And like on the fly, she would do the math, and every time she addresses, whether it's me personally in a DM or whether it's in a group, she addresses them in their time. Like, she just does the calculation real quick and then will blurt it out and be like, "Does that work for you?" And they'll be like, "Yeah, that works for me." And I'm like, what is going on here? So she said this one time because someone was just, really struggling, and she said this to me in a private conversation, but she was like, "I know all of your time zones. Can't you know mine?" Right? It's just one, and I know all 11 of yours. And that really got me because I am that ditzy person who's just like, what time is it? Not for only me, but for everyone. And that's just not acceptable. It wasn't okay. I was making my friend feel less because I didn't value her in that way, because I didn't think of her in that way. I didn't think for her. So there are a lot of things, a lot of tools, and apologies for the contrast on that. I'll fix it. But there are a lot of things that are out there today that can help us with this. Cultural research, obviously learning about cultures, having friends that will help you out and give you a hand of like, don't say that or don't do that gesture here. That's been really valuable to me. Time zone apps, that's one. I think I have a screenshot of one, but there's Every Time Zone, which is a web app, Time Buddy, which is an iPhone app. This one is the one I use on my phone now, and I will pull it up on the call, and it lets you have like set like London, Reykjavik, EDT, right? You keep going down. But then the bar of like what time it is now is really, really helpful for people like me who get lost on a map. So this is great because I'll pull it up during meetings, and I really try to intentionally be better because I realized, wow, I was making my teammate or my friend feel this way because I wasn't being conscious of it. Meeting schedulers like Doodle or Let Us Meet are super helpful. And then cultural empathy. You're going to make mistakes, and so are other people. I think this is a running theme throughout all gaps in life, giving grace on both sides. So, I am 2 minutes over, I apologize. We touched on these 5 gaps today, but no matter what gap we're talking about, awareness and empathy and a little bit of humility, they go a long, long way. So come talk to me at the booth. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And yeah, as you said, you can meet her at the Progress booth over there. It's really interesting to see how important it is to recognize and to accept that kind of gaps, because we all need to constantly communicate with each other in order to find the right solutions and in order to find the right place for everybody. Thank you very much, and enjoy the afternoon with lots of sessions.